Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Congressman Kilmer. Congressman, thanks for coming on.
You bet. Great to be with you.
You are the vice chair of the New Democrat Coalition, and the coalition just unveiled the economic opportunity agenda with the mission to, quote, lower costs, fight inflation, and grow the middle class. So can you give us an overview here? What does that look like?
Yeah, and thanks for having me. Our economic opportunity agenda is really the New Democrat Coalition's approach to help grow our economy. It targets some key sectors like like global supply chains and workforce development, things like energy and housing and food production to create a more robust and a more inclusive economy. And our agenda is really focused on not just addressing some of the immediate concerns like inflation and job creation, but also on long-term strategies like diversifying supply chains, investing in clean energy, reforming our tax system, with an aim of making our economy more resilient and more sustainable over the long haul.
Let's talk about that a little further. How do you make the economy more resilient for the long haul?
Well, the good news is you've seen over the last couple years some real progress. The New Democrat Coalition partnering with the Biden administration, and on some issues, our colleagues across the aisle, to have some bipartisan successes that are focused on economic growth. Things like the bipartisan infrastructure law, things like the CHIPS and Science Act, some of the efforts focused on fighting inflation and growing the middle class. So part of our focus is on implementation in that regard, but there's also recognition that there's more that needs to happen. And some of the efforts that I just raised around things like strengthening supply chains and workforce development so that we get all of our best players on the field within our economy is a priority for our coalition, and I think an important step toward growing our economy.
I do want to break this down section by section, but first I do
Sure.
want to go along the point of what you said which is more work needs to be done. As we know, the latest CPI report shows that inflation is down to a 2-year low. But there is a big but there. A reporter here at Forbes, Derek Saul, and I talked about this but, and the but is sticky prices. And I just want to read some of his reporting by the numbers. Prices for items excluding food and energy are up almost 5% year over year. Rent and homeowners' monthly payments soared by 8% because of sticky demand and climbing mortgage payments. Gas and used car prices fell, which is always a good sign, but other costs related to vehicles are on the rise. Car insurance is up 17% year over year, and auto maintenance and repair fees rose 13%. So what does this agenda do to address those concerns for Americans?
Yeah, there's different pieces of it. Some areas where we've seen increase in prices have been related to supply chain disruption. We're still, as a consequence of the pandemic, trying to dig out from some of the disruption caused by the pandemic. And so there's a whole section of our agenda that's focused on supply chains. There's also recognition that there's more steps that can be taken to lower energy prices as we transition to a clean energy economy. Things like efforts to build on the permitting reform progress that occurred at the end of last year so we can streamline some of these clean energy infrastructure investments. Over the long haul, will reduce some of our energy costs for consumers and for businesses. You mentioned housing. We need a whole lot more housing. We have a supply side challenge on the housing front. And we've got proposals that are focused on doing things like eliminating some of the discriminatory zoning policies that might inhibit new housing construction, things like strengthening the low-income housing tax credit, which is a really valuable tool for changing the arithmetic so that if I'm a property owner, if I'm a home builder, that the math works to construct more housing that people can actually afford. Then finally, there's a big piece of our proposal that's just focused on trying to reduce some out-of-pocket costs for the American people. Um, things like the child tax credit, which provides financial assistance to families and helps them make purchases of the things that they need. That helps everybody in our economy, not just lowering the poverty rate for American kids, but helping every family in our country. We've seen some progress on the healthcare side, but there's more that needs to be done to lower healthcare costs, as you mentioned, and to expand health coverage. Among the things that we have proposed includes extending the enhanced premium tax credits, fixing the Medicaid gap, dealing with things like the cost of insulin, which affects a whole lot of families. That was covered in last year in the Inflation Reduction Act for seniors, for folks who are on Medicare. We've got a proposal to do that for everybody. And again, all of these are, I think, common sense steps. Nearly everything in our proposals has seen some bipartisan support. And so our hope is that we can see progress, get some of these ideas across the finish line, and help the American people.
Congressman, let's dive in even a little further and go section by section. Not all of them, but some of the ones I highlighted. Let's start with section 2, which is get more people back to work. At the State of the Union this year, President Biden touted the lowest unemployment rate in over 50 years at 3.4%. Right now, the unemployment rate is at 3.6%, so it ticked upwards slightly. So how do you get people back to work?
Yeah, there's a few steps in this. One, we know that there are people who need jobs, and we also know that there are jobs that need people. And some of our proposals deal with things like improving skills training so that we can address that skills mismatch. We also know that there's folks who have unfortunately been sidelined for one reason or another, but often care is the big issue. So expanding access to paid family medical leave, dependent care, so that more parents and caretakers can have financial security and remain in the workforce rather than having to drop out of the workforce is really important. A lot of our focus is on workforce development, making sure that there's high quality job training so workers can get into some of the in-demand fields that right now are hurting for workers. And then finally, an area that I think is ripe for opportunity, and frankly, our coalition has had some conversations across the aisle with our Republican colleagues, is immigration reform. Having immigration reform that secures the borders, that improves the process of legal immigration, is valuable because it can strengthen the American workforce and put more skilled workers and even in sectors of the economy like the agriculture sector that are hurting for workers, being able to leverage the immigrant workforce, I think can be a really valuable instrument, but it requires modernizing our immigration laws.
Congressman, can you give us any insight into those conversations with Republicans? What does that look like? Where do you think you can find bipartisanship in this area?
I think on the immigration front, the reality is it may be only when there is divided government that there's opportunity for immigration reform. I think we've learned over the last, decade and a half that when the parties try to go it alone, it's just not going anywhere. And so I think that there is bipartisan appetite by sort of the folks in the middle for steps that would secure the border, that would reform our immigration court system, that would update the asylum process so that we address some of the challenges that we've seen on the southern border, that would provide legal protections and a pathway to citizenship for dreamers, which we've heard our Republican colleagues express a willingness to support. And then, as I mentioned, trying to modernize our employment-based immigration laws so that, one, we have more workers in our workforce, but two, that we're not creating a disadvantage where we've got employers that are playing by the rules put at a disadvantage against those employers that aren't.
Congressman, I've talked to Democrats, Republicans, everyone's saying there's a crisis at the border. They want to secure the border. You just said you want to secure the border. So when you say that, what does that specifically look like?
Well, you've seen, in the past few years, a bipartisan proposal. One of our coalition's members, Pete Aguilar, and former Congressman Will Hurd had a proposal that did a number of things. One, it called for a mile-by-mile assessment of the southern border, and addressing, and putting resources towards those policies and tools that might be most helpful. In some instances, that might be more people, more Customs and Border Patrol officers. In some instances, that may be the use of technology. In some instances, it may be physical structure. In some instances, it may be something else. But doing that in a comprehensive and strategic way, rather than just in a way that might sell, bumper stickers, build the wall or what have you, I think is a more thoughtful approach, and one that previously has had bipartisan support. We also know that the immigration court system, where you have people who are coming to the southern border seeking asylum, and right now the system is just overwhelmed. So part of that is updating that process, trying to reduce some of the pressure valve at the border so that people can start that process someplace other than at the southern border, but also making sure that there's sufficient immigration judges, that there's appropriate due process rights as people go through that process, I think is valuable and something that, again, has seen strong bipartisan support. We just have to make sure that it's put into a package that can be brought forward in the Congress.
Congressman, I now want to leap to Section 4, lower energy prices and transition to a clean energy economy. According to the Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 made, quote, the single largest investment in climate and energy in American history. How specifically would this agenda implement that investment?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, there's been tremendous progress on the clean energy front. And not only will this over time help secure energy independence, but over time it will also lower prices. Part of that means just implementing some of the investments that were made in the Inflation Reduction Act. We also know, and again, this is an area where we have begun bipartisan conversations with some of our Republican colleagues on permitting reform. The capacity to streamline some of the clean energy infrastructure processes in a way that reduce energy costs, again, with a specific focus on energy transmission and on electrical grid resiliency, I think is just ripe for opportunity. And this is something where it requires a little bit of nuance, which Congress is not always good at, right? We know that there's been proposals from the Republicans that say, hey, we can do permitting reform if we just kind of roll over all environmental laws that protect clean air, clean water, and endangered species. President Biden's not going to sign that. At the same time, we've seen some in my party who've said, all environmental laws were written on stone tablets handed down from God and shall never be adjusted in any way. That's probably not right either, right? There's a way to do this that says, let's have common sense reforms that might, where there's something that takes 10 steps, try to reduce it to 3 or 4 steps that continues to protect clean air, clean water, and endangered species, but might rationalize the process in a way that can streamline it, that can see these investments happen, which is both important from the standpoint of combating the climate crisis, but also when we see these investments come online, it will reduce energy costs, and that's a good thing too.
You did mention that you're beginning to talk to Republicans on this issue. Are they coming on board? Are they coming to the table?
I give a lot of credit to some of the business organizations, groups like the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce have convened some discussions to try to encourage this type of bipartisan dialogue. Again, we're in a period of divided government. So if we're going to see proposals move in Congress, by its nature, it needs to be able to pass the House, which is currently in Republican hands, pass the Senate, which is in Democratic hands, and be signed by a Democratic president. That means neither party's going to get everything it wants. And it particularly means that Democrats and Republicans, if we want to move forward on this, have to be able to talk to each other and listen to each other and work together. And that's really where our coalition is trying to lean in.
Congressman, that's a really interesting point. And in this Congress specifically, how do you see the relationship between Democrats and Republicans right now?
Mixed bag, right? It's a mixed bag. Obviously, you've seen some examples where Democrats and Republicans have been able to come together on an issue here or there. I think there was some hope, candidly, when the debt ceiling agreement was passed. And listen, neither party got everything it wanted to in that agreement, but there was some hope that not only did we avert economic catastrophe by defaulting, but it set the table for moving forward on the appropriations process, where oftentimes the thing that holds up the appropriations process the most is the inability to get agreement on the size of the pie, and then what's the part of the pie that goes to defense and what goes to non-defense. That got agreed to in the debt ceiling agreement. And there was, I think, hope coming out of that perhaps Democrats and Republicans would be able to move forward quickly and on time for a change with the appropriations process. Now, the problem is, and I don't say this in a partisan way, this is just a statement of fact, that agreement lasted about a week until Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans said, no, we're not going to abide by that agreement, and we're going to mark up appropriations bills at a far lower level. I think that's a missed opportunity for sure, but it's also choosing the path of greatest resistance. And so, I think it's really a mixed bag right now. It takes two to tango, and the House majority I think too often during this Congress has said we'll rather try to placate the very far right extremist Republicans rather than work across the aisle.
Congressman, let's move on to a subject that you already brought up, which is Section 5, increase affordable housing. Low housing inventory, as you said, continues to be a problem. It hasn't even bounced back since the 2008 housing crash. But how does this agenda address the inventory shortage?
I'll give a couple of, a few examples. One, as we address some of the workforce issues, as we address some of the supply chain issues, that ought to help with both material shortages that are showing up in the housing sector, but also, if you talk to any home builder in the country, they will tell you, hey, if you know someone who knows how to swing a hammer, send them our way. And so, a lot of these priorities are interrelated. Beyond that, I'll give you a couple of examples. Having the infrastructure law implemented in a way that coordinates housing and infrastructure planning and development can be really quite helpful. Things like transit-oriented development. We just saw an investment made in a sewer project in my district where I went and visited with Habitat for Humanity. They said without sewer, this plot of land can have, I think it was 5 housing units. And with sewer, they can have 220 housing units. And so that's a terrific example of where something that has already passed, the bipartisan infrastructure law, being implemented in a way that coordinates housing investment and infrastructure development can be really very valuable. I mentioned, one of our priorities is to eliminate discriminatory zoning policies. I've got a bill that's called the Yes in My Backyard Act that simply tries to encourage local governments to eliminate some of these discriminatory zoning policies, to allow things that might enable more density, things like accessory dwelling units, more zoning for multifamily housing. We have a supply side problem, and those things that can drive greater supply, whether it be eliminating discriminatory policies that inhibit more density, or tools like tax policies like the low-income housing tax credit that enable developers to build more low-income housing, more housing that people can actually afford, I think could be really, really valuable.
On the other side, rent payments have jumped 8%, and Moody's Analytics found that the average renter in the United States is considered rent stressed. So how does this agenda help those Americans?
Again, if you look at the data, we need about 10 to 12 million additional housing units. And so part of this is if we can address the supply side problem, it should, provide a pressure release for renters. So that there is more housing that people can afford. I will mention, when we spoke about the appropriations process, one of the challenges we face right now is that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are proposing very significant cuts to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That moves us in the wrong direction when it comes to housing affordability, including in terms of things like vouchers for people who might otherwise struggle to afford housing. If you cut those things, you're going to have more and more people who are struggling to make rent.
Congressman, you just introduced this plan. What's next?
Well, ours is a coalition that's really focused on trying to make progress on thoughtful public policy. And so, we didn't put this out to be a white paper that goes into the ether. We put it as an agenda that we want to work with the Biden administration on, that we want to work with our Republican colleagues on, and with our Democratic colleagues, both in the House and in the Senate, again, with the hope of continuing to address some of our short-term challenges, including inflation, and to make sure that we have a strong and resilient economy going forward. So that's the plan. We're going to evangelize this agenda with as many folks as we can. We're going to carve out specific initiatives that we can work with our colleagues on, and really just try to get more pucks into the net for the American people.
It's refreshing to hear you're not just putting this out into the ether. I'm happy you came on to discuss it with me, but is there a specific timeline here?
I think some of these it's gonna depend on the item, right? We're focused on implementation of things that have already passed. Those are near-term issues where we can work immediately with the administration. Some of these things may require passing laws, which, as you know, in the Congress is not always an overnight project, but it is one that I think we're really committed to. And so again, the faster we can make progress, as I look at the progress that needs to be made, it's a little bit like, all of our favorite cold medicines. We want these reforms to be fast acting and long lasting. We want to make sure that we're making progress that provides some relief to folks who might be struggling with inflation right now. And we want to make sure that we have a strong, resilient economy that is growing and where, regardless of what zip code you live in, that people can prosper, that we're getting more Americans into the workforce, that we're providing relief from price increases for the American people. That's something that needs to happen both now and over time.
Congressman Derek Kilmer, thanks for coming on.
You bet. Thanks for having me.